Good evening. I'm Emily Vogt, Academic Dean at Chicago Theological Seminary. I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to our annual Andre LaCocque Lecture. We're so happy to have with us tonight Reza Aslan and Katherine Stewart, who will be having an interreligious dialogue about religion and politics, talking together about issues that drive us apart. The Andre LaCocque Lecture is one of our annual named lectures, and its purpose is to showcase the diversity of religion within the human experience. It helps us honor our commitment to interreligious engagement, to the joyous embrace of religious diversity, and to our goal of advancing understanding and collaboration among the rich multiplicity of spiritual traditions and life stances in the world. Tonight, we will also present the Herman E. Schaalman Interreligious Award to a student. This award honors the passionate commitment to interreligious engagement modeled by the late Rabbi Herman E. Schaalman. We're grateful for your attendance and your support of this work. We are also so grateful to Katherine Stewart and Reza Aslan for being here to share their wisdom and insights in this moment of uncertainty and upheaval in American politics. Thank you for coming. We're happy you're here tonight, and we have a wonderful evening planned for you. I'm going to turn it over now to Hazel Gomez, who is a current Bayan student and a member of the Interreligious Engagement Committee, and she is going to speak more about Andre LaCocque's history at CTS. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. May the peace and love of the divine be with each and every one of you. Welcome again. I am so honored to share space with all of you. Beautiful to see some familiar names and some new names as well. So my name is Hazel Gomez. I am a Master of Divinity student at Bayan, and I am incredibly grateful and so honored to be able to learn from various CTS professors while on my learning journey. So the Andre LaCocque Interreligious Lecture, it showcases the diversity of religion in the human experience. It is named in honor of Dr. Andre LaCocque, the longtime CTS professor and stalwart supporter of interreligious work, who passed away in January of 2022. In the mid-1960s, Dr. Andre LaCocque, a distinguished scholar of the Hebrew Bible, originally from Belgium, he joined the faculty at CTS as professor of Hebrew Bible. He founded a doctoral program in comparative religious studies known as the Center for Jewish Christian Studies. This center was designed to serve as a research hub for doctoral students and as a training ground for a new generation of scholars who understood that early Christianity could not be fully grasped without also understanding Judaism. It has also become a venue for public conferences. Dr. LaCocque frequently co-taught with Rabbi Herman Schaalman, a respected religious leader and activist in Chicago, helping to instill the belief that religious leaders must be knowledgeable about traditions beyond their own into the very fabric of what we do at CTS. Later, Dr. LaCocque broadened the scope of the Center for Jewish Christian Studies to incorporate Islamic scholarship, organizing the first national conference on women in Islam, featuring prominent Muslim scholars. This evolution led to the creation of the Center for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Studies, one of the nation's pioneering centers focused on fostering interreligious dialogue among the Abrahamic faiths. Dr. LaCocque retired in 1996, but continued to contribute to CTS and beyond for many years. Today, that work is carried on by the CTS Interreligious Institute, which has expanded its focus to include interreligious dialogue across all spiritual life stances. We at CTS owe much to the work of Dr. LaCocque, and we are grateful to tonight's speakers who honor his legacy. Thank you.
Hello, all. It is wonderful to see so many faces interested in this conversation tonight and dedicated to fostering interfaith dialogue and understanding. My name is Chad Swickerath, and I'm the Vice President for Advancement in Strategic Initiatives here at Chicago Theological Seminary. Here at the seminary, your support helps push the boundaries of progressive theological education through programs like tonight's lecture and the Schaalman Award. We educate leaders who are ready to address complex social issues with compassion and insight. If you enjoy tonight's programming, if you learn something interesting, I invite you to strengthen your support for the mission of CTS in two ways. First, I ask that you share the lecture with someone you know. Second, I ask you to consider a gift to the seminary. You can do so through the link here in the chat. Your generosity sustains our community and amplifies the impact of our work. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Good evening, everyone. I am Camila Hall-Sharp, Assistant Professor of Hebrew Bible and Public Ministry here at CTS. And I once again welcome everybody and so grateful that you all are joining us this evening. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our esteemed speakers for the evening. We have Katherine Stewart and Reza Aslan as our speakers who will have a conversation with Rabbi Mikvah. So Katherine Stewart's new book, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, has been praised by Congressman Jamie Raskin as an indispensable citizen's guide to the anti-democratic MAGA right in America. Her previous book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, was voted first place for excellence in nonfiction books by the Religion News Association and forms the basis of the documentary feature film, God and Country, produced by Rob Rayner. She writes for the New York Times, New Republic, Religion News Service, and others. Welcome, Katherine Stewart. We also have Reza Aslan, a renowned writer, commentator, professor, Emmy and Peabody nominated producer, and scholar of religions. A recipient of the prestigious James Joyce Award, Aslan is the author of 3 internationally best-selling books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. His biography, An American Martyr in Persia, The Epic Life and Tragic Death of Howard Baskerville, was nominated for the Penn-Jacqueline Beograd Weld Award. His producing credits include the acclaimed HBO series The Leftovers and the hit CBS comedy United States of Alabama. He is the host and executive producer of CNN's Believer and Rough Draft with Reza Aslan, as well as co-host with Rainn Wilson of the podcast Metaphysical Milkshake. His newest book is titled A Kid's Book About Israel and Palestine. We welcome Katherine and Reza. Thank you for being with us tonight.
I want to echo Dr. Hall-Sharp's deep gratitude that you are here. I'm Rabbi Dr. Rachel Mikvah, professor of Jewish Studies and senior faculty fellow here at CTS for our Interreligious Institute. We are very grateful also for all of you who've taken the time to join us this evening. What's going to happen is I'm going to ask Katherine and Reza a bunch of questions. We'll have some conversation. You'll notice our idea about a lecture is not so much a lecture as a dialogue, because we believe so much in navigating across the differences that sometimes tear us apart. We'll talk for about 35, 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. We will take questions in the chat. If you'd rather vocalize your question, we are set up as a Zoom room and not a webinar, so you can raise your hand with the little raise hand function at that point, and we'll try to take questions that way, but be respectful, keep it short so that folks have time to answer. So let's jump in. Everyone knows the maxim that in polite company, we're supposed to avoid talking about religion or politics. But both of you have made these topics the centerpiece of a lot of your work. So can you each tell us a little bit about your journeys, how you arrived at the topics and the foci for your work in the first place? Katherine, you want to start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'd like to start by thanking you, everyone at the Chicago Theological Seminary, my co-panelist Reza Aslan, and all of you who have joined today. And thanks for the question. It's a really good reminder of how challenging these topics can be. On my journey as a reporter, I've come across examples that were very uncomfortable. I think sometimes our default position is towards civility. We all want to respect one another's faith. We want to acknowledge their histories and their lived realities and respect them. But, I've come across examples where certain kinds of religion are clearly being exploited for political ends. So I'll tell you, that's sort of how I got my start in this reporting. I'll tell you a little bit about it. 16 years ago in Santa Barbara, California, a program that aims to indoctrinate children as young as 5 into a very reactionary form of the Christian faith showed up at my children's public elementary school. The program confuses very little kids into thinking that their public school endorses a particular form of religion. Public schools have a cloak of authority, and especially in the minds of very young kids. They think if it's in their school, that's what their school wants them to believe. At the time, some evangelical parents who attended our school offered the club free and better space in the evangelical church next door to the school. Because they said, they met with the leaders of the club. They said, we too are evangelical. We believe in the Great Commission, but you're just not right for the school. So here's some great space for you. The Good News Club leaders declined and insisted that they wanted to start their program in the schools. So what I saw then just didn't make sense. Why were they forcing their way into our kids' public elementary school, especially after they'd been offered space at the church next door? The people who ran the club were calling our public school their mission field. They were calling, pardon me, other people's children the harvest. What do they mean? So I was really intrigued. I sort of followed this thread. I found that the topic was much bigger than I imagined. The most important thing I've observed over time is how much the Christian nationalist movement has evolved. The core ideology hasn't changed so much, but its appeal and strategy has broadened to a massive degree, and its influence over one of America's 2 major political parties is really now indisputable. At the time, it was clear to me that the leaders of this initiative were exploiting religion to pursue a political agenda that was profoundly at odds with American democracy. But this organization, I realized, was just one small component of a leadership-driven, organization-driven political machine. The movement's legal ecosphere is one of the most vital features. It's tactical, well-organized. And when I started researching that sort of legal sphere, I grasped that this movement represented a threat to core democratic principles and institutions. And that's why in 2012, I published my first book in this field. My research has sort of continued over time, and the movement's strength has expanded. Its influence over, all aspects of our politics has expanded. Its influence in the law has expanded. And I would have to say the most pernicious aspect of this movement, in my view, is the mainstreaming of lies and bad faith arguments. Many representatives of the movement have convinced themselves that any means justifies the end when it comes to achieving godly rule. For that reason, they're funding and working with massive disinformation and propaganda operations, which I describe at length in the book, my new book, Money, Lies, and God. So I'll stop here. There's a lot more to say, but
We'll give you a chance to say it.
Reza, and we've got a lot to talk about.
Reza?
My turn. Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you, everyone. It's such a joy to be here, connected with CTS.
Which
Some
you've
of you
been
may
for a
not
long
know.
time.
That's what I was going to say, is some of you may not know that I spent many, many, many years as a trustee of Chicago Theological Seminary. So I have an enormous amount of affection for the institution, the faculty, the students, the administration, most of whom are still there, which is incredible. And it really is wonderful to be here with my dear friend Rachel. And I've been a fan of Katherine's for a long time. So it's all very exciting
Likewise,
to
back
be
at you.
a part of this conversation. Let's see, my journey. Well, so I was born in Iran and lived through the Iranian Revolution. So that should give you a little sense of where my understanding of the intersection of religion and politics comes from. I didn't come from a very religious family, but the experience of revolutionary Iran and being able to watch the power that religion has to motivate the masses, the currency that it holds with the masses, for good and for bad, was, I think, something that really created a lasting impression on me. Iran, like so many places around the world, religion and politics are sort of one and the same. And when we came to the United States, despite sort of the impression that I think the U.S. likes to project around the world, what I discovered was a country that was equally, if not more, interested in inserting religion into the public space and certainly into politics. And I think what that gave me a real sense of, and it's a theme that I think permeates a lot of my work and my commentary, is that as much as, like Rachel said when we began this conversation, that we like to think of religion and politics as these two different strands that really should not have anything to do with one another, and maybe it is true that they should not, but it's inevitable that they will. And part of the reason for that has to do with the fact that both of them are markers of identity. I think that's an important point, and that's something that I will probably bring up about a dozen more times. But also, I think unless your religion is of a monastic quality, for the most part, you are interested in inserting your morality into your world, right? That your religion isn't just about the things that you believe, it's about a viewpoint. It's about how you understand the world and your place in it. And so obviously it is going to have a profound effect on the way that you navigate the public realm, whether that be in the decisions you make about your economic situation, your social situation, the morals and values that you hold on to, and then, of course, your political viewpoint. And so, I'd love to be one of these people who say, if we can just remove religion from politics, then everything would be great. I think history has taught us that that's not necessarily true, but more importantly, I think that that is a profound misunderstanding of what religion and frankly politics actually are, that you think that you could simply excise the two and keep them separate. And I'm sure this will be something that we'll continue to talk about as we discuss the admittedly pernicious role that religious nationalism has played both here in the United States and in countries around the world.
Let's start with that. So the subtitle for our program is Talking Together About Issues That Drive Us Apart. And we asked our students to submit questions about the issues that are on their minds. And more than one came back about the increasing influence of Christian nationalism and religious nationalisms. So here's the form of one question, showing how deep I think and thoughtful our students are, right? This question said, how do we effectively counter the rise of white Christian nationalism when it has successfully embedded itself within both religious and political institutions, framing itself as the true Christianity, while using faith as a weapon for exclusion, oppression, and authoritarianism? So, Katherine, since you have 3 books on the subject of Christian nationalism within a broader anti-democratic movement, can you start us off with a working definition of Christian nationalism? And then the two of you can collectively sort of tackle the complex of queries that are embedded in that question.
Absolutely. Well, Christian nationalism is an anti-democratic political ideology that says America was founded to be an explicitly Christian nation. Our laws should be based on a reactionary reading of the Bible, and we've somehow lost this heritage that once made us great. and we need to get back to that. So it's an exclusionary form of nationalism. It's an idea of who gets to properly belong in the country and who doesn't. Christian nationalism is also a leadership-driven political movement, an organized quest for power. The movement, as I mentioned, is leadership-driven. It's also organization-driven. The strength of that movement is in its deep organizational infrastructure, 5+ decades of investment, huge amounts of money in different features of that infrastructure have made it as powerful as it is today. We can divide some of those features into categories. There are policy groups, legal advocacy groups, networking organizations that get members of the leadership on the same page. There are data initiatives. I think a very underappreciated feature of the movement is the pastor networks. Leaders of the movement know that pastors are often the most trusted voices in their communities. If they can get the pastors on board, they can get their congregants out to vote. So there are networks that I describe in my work, such as Faith Wins and Watchmen on the Wall, where you go to a church and there are dozens or sometimes hundreds of pastors there, and they're being given talking points, very sophisticated messaging materials, voter guides that leave absolutely no question about how these congregants are supposed to vote, their biblical values. Sometimes they're actually, unfortunately, also spreading lies. One of the gatherings I went to, they brought an elections integrity specialist who had all kinds of things to say about dead people voting and, rehashing debunked conspiracy theories. And these tools are available to everyone. I'm not saying that people shouldn't distribute voter guides or talk about their values in church. I'm just showing how the movement has the strength that it is. And, you don't need to, much of the movement functions as a giant voter turnout machine in election cycles, and you don't need to have a majority of the population to support your candidate. All you need is a disproportionately motivated minority of people to vote. So this movement really does punch above its political weight in election cycles. And I think that was, I'd love to sort of address the second part of that question, which is, how do we counter the rise of this thing when it's successfully embedded itself in these religious institutions and called itself the true Christianity? I want to point out that religious leaders articulating Christian nationalist ideas are not the only voices out there. Hardly. There are hundreds, perhaps, of faith-based organizations out there aiming to convey a very different message about the faith. So if you don't see your values being reflected in the public discourse, one thing you can do is get involved in one of those organizations in order to amplify your voice and perspective and help amplify those of others. The most effective way, I think, to show people that this kind of grievance politics and authoritarianism really doesn't represent the Christianity that you know and that other people know is to get involved. And I think, we might cover some of the other ways people can get involved going forward. But I also want to be clear, the religious right and the religious left are not the equivalent. Liberal and progressive religious organizations don't have the money. They don't have the organizational capacity of the religious right, but they do have a lot of theology and activism on their side. And I just want to wrap up by saying that a measure of the threat that progressive Christianity and even moderate Christianity poses to the movement is reflected in the rhetoric of Christian nationalist leaders. So I saw this in action when I attended America Fest last December. It's an annual gathering hosted by Turning Point USA. And the speakers were profoundly hostile to what they called progressive or woke Christianity. A speaker there named Lucas Miles, he's the head of Turning Point USA Faith, the organization's outreach arm. He's the author of a book titled Woke Jesus, the False Messiah Destroying Christianity. So what is woke Jesus, you might ask? Well, according to Miles, he traced it back to the 1700s. He said it came in with the social gospel, it came in with the historical Jesus movement, it came in with liberation theology and Black liberation theology. And he actually told the crowd at a breakout session, unfortunately, we have a generation of pastors who have been indoctrinated by progressive seminaries. I don't know, was he talking about you guys? So he said the solution to what is this quote, he said this heretical idea called progressive Christianity is that he's working with some 3,500 other churches and leaders whose goal is to eradicate wokeism from the American pulpit. So it's, again, very hard to explain, like to convey the degree to which the politics leads the religion here, because another speaker said, the audience at one panel, he's a Turning Point Faith Action field rep, he said there's absolutely no biblical justification to vote Democrat. So you can really see there's very little sort of space between the sort of hardline religion and a kind of hardline politics in this context.
I mean, that was such a complete answer. I really don't know what I could possibly add to that. I'll just say two quick notes, which is, and again, kudos to the student body at CTS to put that adjective white before Christian nationalist, because we can't have this conversation without talking about race. I'm sure most everyone here is familiar with the data sets that we've seen over and over again. Pew has given us a lot of insight into the way in which this new muscular form of Christianity that has always been present, I think, in American religious landscape, but really since the early 1980s, end of the 70s, has become adept at manipulating the political space to its own advantage. And we know that this is a racially polarized movement. We see it very clearly in the voting patterns of these different groups. Ad nauseum, we have talked about the enigma of the record-breaking white evangelical Christians who continue to not just vote for Donald Trump, but to support Donald Trump, despite the fact that he is the least Christian candidate for president I think we have had in generations. But what is often lost in that conversation is the majorities, large majorities, not nearly as large as voted for Donald Trump, white evangelicals, but majorities of evangelicals of color who have voted either for Biden or for Clinton or for Harris. Now, again, presumably, theologically speaking, these evangelical Christians share pretty much the same belief system, obviously with, variations. What they don't share is skin color. And I think oftentimes in these conversations, and there's so much historical and sociological background to this, and we'll get into some of that, we tend to bypass the stark racial divide that has to be discussed when talking about the rise of Christian nationalism in the US. So that's, I think, one part of it. The other part of it that we can't also forget, and it goes to, Katherine's point about not equating the Christian left and the Christian right, because the power dynamics, just speak for themselves. Well, there's a very real reason for that, which is that the primary focus, and this again goes back to the 80s, of the Christian right, and particularly the Christian nationalist movement, is power. It's not morality. It's not, I think sometimes we have this conversation that, oh, what this is a community that is focused on promoting their moral values in the public space. And there's some truth to that. But the primary focus is to accumulate the power necessary so that one can just simply dictate those moral values upon society rather than go through the hard slog of actually taking part in the public marketplace of ideas and putting your opinions, your viewpoints, your moral values to the public and letting them vote and decide on whether they agree with you or not. And that, I think, more than anything else, uh, explains the enormous and sudden rise of this community over the last, let's call it, decade or so. And more starkly, of course, when it comes to their relationship with Donald Trump, who made it very clear in the most explicit, transactional way possible, ignore the fact that I am the incarnation of the seven deadly sins, and I'll give you whatever you want transactionally. Not that I believe what you want, not that I share what you want, but I don't care. And I will just simply hand power over to you. We saw that certainly in the first term, and it is being supercharged in the second term. And it's hard to say with any kind of optimism where this is going to lead us in these next few years.
Well, to some extent, white Christian nationalism animates anti-immigrant sentiment. We've seen it for a long time. We saw it in the Jews Will Not Replace Us, right? In Charlottesville, resulting from a wild conspiracy theory that Jews support immigrants because we want to eliminate the white majority in the US. But anti-immigrant sentiment has exploded. It went well beyond the Christian nationalist community and played a huge factor in the election. So how is it, let's think about the role of religion here beyond the Christian nationalists, right? How is it that a religion putatively grounded in the Bible in terms of Christianity, but other folks too, right? But the Bible mentions over 30 times the need to care for the stranger, right? But it has been effectively wielded as a weapon against migrants. So how does this come to pass, right? You've already articulated that in history, both global history and US history, Christianity has shown its face both as a tool of empire, right, and as a liberating force. But this immigrant question really has really shown a really ugly side of America's. So can you talk a little bit about that and especially about the religious dimensions of that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think people in societies, many societies, have a tendency to focus on or distrust those who are different, outsiders. So when they're encouraged to do so by demagogues, it's like they're throwing gasoline on a kind of ember that's already there. The fear and phobia, I think, comes first, and the leap to some form of religious justification for it follows, I would say. So it's often the case that the anti-immigrant sentiment comes first and the religion kind of swings behind it. I think this movement is very good at tapping into people's sort of unexamined prejudices or fears. But we also have to point out, look, I mean, the immigrant, anti-immigrant thing, it's a way of othering. This is what a lot of authoritarian leaders do. They want to activate these very divisive issues in order to divide the public. And, divide and conquer is the oldest strategy in the book. And it's happening now because in America, we have to point out that a number of Christians empathize with the immigrant plight. And that's why they've set up sanctuaries in churches. So if there's any anti-Christian persecution going on, it's really the current administration going after churches offering sanctuary. But
churches and synagogues and other places,
yeah,
other
exactly.
houses of worship too.
Houses of worship, absolutely. I didn't, want to imply that any one house of worship or type is doing that. But while some of the alt-right groups are explicitly Christian nationalists, the alt-right groups that are like vehemently anti-immigrant, I think a lot of alt-right people are actually not Christian nationalist or not religious at all. Many of them, some of those groups started out with a religious identity, but some started out like the Proud Boys as atheistic, and they kind of adopted a Christian nationalist ideology later in order to provide a further justification for their actions. They saw that, Donald Trump was doing what sort of autocratic leaders often do, which is, surround himself with holy men and sort of conflate his authority with the authority of a religion, and they think, oh, well, I want some of that, or I want to participate in some of that. So the Proud Boys, as I understand it, really started as a thuggish militia group motivated mainly by racial anxieties, but they ended up sort of finding religion because it helps them justify what they want to do. It's really their grievances that drove them toward racism and the kind of, I would say, fascism. Can we say that word here? We use the F word. And they end up finding religion along the way. But, you know, the thing about fascist movements is they always start targeting some vulnerable minority, but it never ends with the one minority that they're targeting. It always sort of moves to other targets, because again, the whole point of this sort of divisiveness is to divide the population. Now, when we're talking about immigration, of course, you know, every country has a right to establish its own policies. It has to consider various factors and variables having to do with, you know, what's happening in different countries and needs that their own countries may have for immigrant labor, a kind of a sense of responsibility to offer shelter for people who absolutely need it, but also making sure that things are done in a certain proper way. But that's not the way the right is describing, is sort of talking about religion. Talking about immigration. They're talking about it in this very punitive way, this very othering way. And it's almost like they're delighting in the cruelty, the child separation policy, separating babies from their mothers. I mean, I cannot imagine the mental torture involved in for everybody who's sort of caught up in that kind of disgraceful policy. And even showing the, you know, having a little TikTok or something of an immigrant being deported and, you know, capturing that and calling it ASMR, which is like a kind of thing that, you know, I don't know what it stands for, but do you guys know what it is? It's like listening to sounds slowly, and it sounds kind of wonderful, and marketing that as like sort of promoting that as ASMR. So people are supposed to sort of laugh at the cruelty of this person being shackled and calling all immigrants criminals. I mean, it's the cruelty is the point here, and that sort of othering the out group, giving people a scapegoat upon which to focus their grievances and a scapegoat to hate. That's what autocratic leaders do.
Yeah, you know, I started out by saying I was going to mention identity about a dozen times, and this will be a couple of those times. Catherine's absolutely right. Look, we're having a very difficult time for a whole host of reasons defining what it means to be American, right? I think our collective identity is under assault from outside forces, from, you know, within. And as everyone knows, it's often very difficult to say with any measure of confidence who you are, but it's extraordinarily simple to say who you aren't. And the idea that we find some perceived outsider to act as a kind of negative pole through which we can identify ourselves and our values against is not a new phenomenon, either for the United States or frankly for humanity. I remind everyone that, you know, the end of the 19th century, after a surge of Irish Catholic immigration into the United States, there was profound anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. We actually passed federal laws in the United States curbing Catholic immigration. In the interwar period, the negative pole switched to Jews. And this was a time of profound anti-Semitism. Hasn't really ebbed much since then, but you have people like Charles Lindbergh, heroic figures like Charles Lindbergh, icons like Henry Ford, who were espousing the most grotesque forms of anti-Semitism in the mainstream. And certainly, I think, the 21st century, that negative pole has now, in many ways, shifted as much towards Muslims or even Mexicans or just generally brown people as another means of identifying oneself. That's where the whole clash of civilizations mentality came from. The idea that we can define something as undefinable as the West, which is not a real thing, simply by creating another imaginary category called Islam. And then we will just define what is West by whatever is not Islam. So this is a fairly common experience for us in the United States. And as Katherine says, it is a very powerful means, not just of identity formation, but of creating a kind of umbrella over the myriad grievances, some of which are very legitimate grievances, that so many people, so many different groups have, but have a difficult time linking with one another. And so anti-immigrant sentiment, especially in the sense that by definition, an immigrant is someone who is new to this country, right? And so someone who does not get to be part of whatever definition we are trying to create of what it means to be American becomes the most obvious aspect of that other, becomes a kind of umbrella around which secular groups, fascist groups, religious groups, and not just Christian groups, by the way, groups both on the far right and groups on the left can kind of combine under this issue, which again, as I think Rachel, you said very clearly, has some reality to it. Our immigration system is completely in shambles. But to weaponize it as a form of collective identity, in order to promote political issues that really have nothing to do with immigration or border security, is
power,
a pretty
what
old
Katherine was
story.
saying.
They have to do with power, is what they have to do with.
Right. So I appreciate you both sort of naming the instrumentalization of religion in these things, and the way it's used as justification. We'll come back to others, because I think this is very important for us to talk about, but I want to explore other nationalisms, right? The rise of Christian nationalism in the US is not happening in a vacuum. So can we talk for a minute about how religious nationalism is used to consolidate authoritarian power in other places and why this is manifesting now around the world?
Well, Americans are not exceptional in this matter. What happens here follows a certain pattern we see in many other places around the world and throughout history. There are certainly nuances specific to different countries and regions, but when you have a leader who wants to consolidate more authoritarian forms of power, who binds themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in their own countries, what they're doing is they're like bubble wrapping themselves in sanctimony, to guard against any investigation of their own corruption, their self-dealing, the cronyism that they're involved with, the way they're maybe enriching family members or people in their inner circle at the public's expense. They don't want people looking at the way they suppress or abuse their own people.
There's a host of sins.
Exactly. So you can describe these countries as, I would say, theocratic in a certain fake sense, and that there's an official religion. Their laws may be based on their holy texts, depending on the context, but they're more accurately described, I think, as cronyistic kleptocracies with suppression of free speech, denial of individual rights, and no tolerance for political opposition. A final note I want to say, and we've got to bring this up, in America, rising inequality, economic inequality, creates a population with a lot of grievances. I mean, over the last decades, we've seen huge amounts of money coalesce at the tippy top of the economic ladder, and things are really a lot harder for most Americans than they used to be. The cost of housing, the cost of groceries, job insecurity, rights for the workforce, et cetera. It's really hard for a lot of people. You've got two parents and you've got four jobs, and you still can't, quite make it work. And then we have an oligarchy that has extreme wealth and power, and a sector of that oligarchy feels extremely insecure, and is actually funding the movement. I mean, we're seeing some of the funders, we're seeing donations like in the realm of $1.6 billion that Barry Side donated to create the Marble Freedom Trust, and he put Leonard Leo in charge of it. You have Bradley Foundation, which I believe has about a similar amount of money. You have people like Musk, a tech bro. Do you think he's motivated by religion? No, he just sees that as the price of doing business, working with these sort of religious nationalists in order to get the economic policies and tax privileges that he wants, the sort of privileged contracts with the government. So, but this kind of inequality, just to take a step back, is associated often with the rise of harsh and punishing religions because it keeps the little people in line. And pretty much everywhere, oligarchs who are on board with this figure out that this strand of religion, a harsh strand, can be their best friend. So every country has its own story, of course, and I don't want to put too many things in one bucket, but the fundamental dynamics are often very similar to what's happening in the United States.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you asked this question because we can't think about this as just an American phenomenon. To be perfectly frank, we're kind of a little bit late to the party. Religious nationalism has become a pernicious force in a wide swath of countries, and it comes in all kinds of flavors. I mean, if you just look at the rise of Jewish nationalism in Israel that has resulted in I mean, to call the Israeli government right wing doesn't do it justice. It's hard to even put a term to it. But it's not just the government, it's society itself. 20 years I've gone to Israel every 2 years, and I don't recognize the country that I went to just a couple of years ago. It has almost wholly been hijacked by this very muscular, what we would refer to as ultra-Orthodox religious nationalism. But it's not just Israel. Obviously, we are seeing the same exact phenomenon taking place in India with the consolidation of power by the BJP, which is fueled by this conception of Hindutva, this idea of not just Hindu nationalism. I think that's the way that Hindutva is often referred to, but it's this kind of conception of Hindu orthodoxy, which if anybody has spent 5 minutes studying Hinduism, that's an oxymoron. Like they literally had to invent a new kind of Hinduism in order to justify the orthodoxy that has fueled the Hindu nationalism that, again, has taken over almost every level of government in India. Look at Myanmar. The 969 movement in Myanmar is Buddhist nationalism. It's a martial, muscular Buddhism that I think would be quite unfamiliar to most Americans who have, any knowledge of Buddhism whatsoever. And then, of course, Islamism has been a force in a number of Muslim majority countries for generations. So, okay, religious nationalism is on the rise everywhere. The question is why? Why? And I'm going to come back to identity again. Let's start with just remembering that what we call nationalism is barely 200 years old. As a concept, it's barely 200 years old. Like, this is not the way that human beings have traditionally created collective identities by drawing borders around themselves and then defining themselves primarily in terms of nation states. So the concept itself is fairly new in most of the world, particularly in those parts of the world in which the populations didn't actually have a hand in drawing those borders or in defining what nationalism actually means. So that's part of it. Part of it has to do with the fact that we have to acknowledge the failure of secular nationalism as a political ideology, the primary political ideology of the 20th century. I mean, we were promised that if we could just strip ourselves of our ethnic and religious identities and reconstitute our sense of identity according to a secular notion of nation state, that we are equal citizens of a nation state, then we'll finally get rid of those centuries of war and violence in the name of religion or in the name of ethnicity or whatever the case may be. How'd that work out for everybody? Yeah, the 20th century was unquestionably the most horrific century in human history. We are talking about the most bestial acts of violence humans have ever enacted upon each other in the name of religion? No. In the name of race? No. In the name of ethnicity? No. In the name of nationalism, in the name of secularism, in the name of atheism, in the name of socialism, in the name of Marxism. And I think for generations of people coming out of that failure of that promise, coupled with the sudden and somewhat disruptive rise of globalization, which began to tell people, hey, you know what? The borders and boundaries that separate you into these distinct nation states, they don't really matter. They're not really there. You should sort of identify yourself in these supra structures, the African Union or the European Union or what have you. When you take all of that into consideration, you get populations that are adrift when it comes to figuring out who they are as individuals and as a collective. And particularly as the concept of secular nationalism begins to dissolve, other more primal forms of identity are going to rise to the surface to take its place. And what more primal identity is there than religious identity, which, going back to what Katherine said, becomes this valuable way of bringing people together under a single umbrella, of uniting disparate grievances together, of making very easy to understand in-groups and out-groups. Do you believe like me? Do you go to the church that I go to? Well, then you're not me, So that has to come into an understanding of how we got to where we are now, where around the world, and even here in the United States of all places, religious nationalism is becoming the primary marker, or I should say, religion is becoming a primary marker of collective identity within the nation state.
I would love to follow that up with some more, but time is getting short. So let's switch gears. Because there are many members in our community that are feeling particularly vulnerable. They are under assault by the torrent of hostile executive orders and other actions of the new administration that not only undermine economic justice, but also the welfare of people who are already marginalized, trans and other queer folk, immigrants, people of color. There's always been othering. But with these assaults, we see the operation of what has become a foolproof political playbook, right? You manufacture a completely non-existent threat involving already marginalized folks to get people to vote for you. So can you talk a little bit about why this works? I mean, this fits into what you were talking about before in terms of othering. But can we explore some more how this dynamic, well, first of all, what's wrong with us? Secondly, how does this dynamic, how's it bound up with the anti-democratic movement, and and maybe a little bit more about how religion fits in this mix?
Thanks. Listen, it's authoritarianism 101. You identify a scapegoat, you encourage people to focus their grievances and resentments against a group that is supposedly responsible for all of their problems. And then once you've basically trained them to hate this way, you can get political power because you can get people to your side. And the tragedy, of course, is that these others who are being identified for hate are not causing any real problems at all. Or if there is an issue, it's one at the margins. I mean, that, the current movement has a lot of groups that it hates: immigrants, the non-religious, liberals, trans and gay people, the deep state. But it
People of
appears
color, women, people of
women,
color,
for sure.
women.
Yeah, we could talk about that for days. But it appears to be focusing a lot of its aggression right now on something called DEI. This seems to be the excuse they need to smash the administrative state, which is what is basically the institutions of a functioning government. Now, of all the many problems that America is facing today, can it really be the case that diversity initiatives are the most dangerous? Well, of course not. What the administration is doing is not opposing DEI because it's divisive or unfair or an overcorrection to a legitimate problem. Because in some instances, maybe there was, but in others, there wasn't. But what they're really doing is transparently restoring white men, and specifically white conservative men, to positions of privilege that they've had in the past. So it's kind of like affirmative action for conservative white men. They're declaring a total war on anti-discrimination law, stripping women and people of color of their accomplishments, casting doubt on the idea that people who aren't in this privileged group might actually be qualified to take on important roles in society. Now, the focus of hate du jour is trans people. When I was at America Fest, I feel like every other speaker spoke about this, issue of trans women in sports. Why would they give this marginal issue so much attention? Authoritarians start with sort of targeting one group that they feel they can target the most easily, but it never ends there. So to me, a small but defining point of survey evidence that shows the effectiveness of this kind of scapegoating comes from those questionnaires or surveys that ask Americans to estimate how many trans people there are in the population. The correct answer, it's hard to know for sure, but it's roughly 0.5%. Maybe we could argue it up to 1% depending on how you look at the data or people define, but it's sort of in that area. But the survey I saw said that the average American thinks it's 17%. 17% of America supposedly trans. Now, this is extraordinary. But here's the thing. How do you go from being less than 1 in 100 to nearly 1 in 5? You turn on Fox News or Newsmax and you go hear one story after another about how trans people are ruining everyone's lives. The right talks about trans people incessantly to distract us from their larger agenda, an agenda that is frankly impoverishing ordinary Americans. It's like, look at this thing over here so you don't notice these issues that are, kitchen table issues. That's your bread and butter issues that are affecting the way your life is not, working out as well as it might.
Since this is the last question before we go to Q&A, and we'll come back at the very end and ask you sort of what can we do thoughts. But Reza, as you weave in your thoughts, can you let's make sure that women who have also suffered tremendous setbacks with the demolition of reproductive rights and weakening of Title IX and resurgent of toxic masculinity and the embrace of overt sexism in politics and popular culture, let's make sure that women get in this conversation too.
Well, this is what it means to make America great again. I mean, it's that idea of a return to a place where white men maintained privilege and power. And you can understand, the anxiety that can sometimes occur if these white men see powerful women in charge of their own bodies. They see trans people, in their view, violating the sort of binary that they have been sort of raised to believe in. They feel threatened by the notion that someone can violate these binaries and then take something away from them. That's exactly what DEI is about. It's about the idea that someone is taking something from you, that this is a zero-sum game, that if someone, a person of color, achieves some advancement, then by definition, that advancement is taken from you. This is what, in the first administration, it was all CRT, and they couldn't tell you what critical race theory meant, so they can't really tell you what DEI means. It is that notion that power rests within this one distinct community, right? Specifically white heterosexual men who obviously have been losing that power over the last half century. And this is an opportunity to regain it. And of course, to the point of women, pardon me for being the one talking about this, but what I will say that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone is that in all societies, and really for most of recorded time, the morals of a civilization or a society are imprinted on the bodies of women. And so I think that, yes, we can look at the profound assault on women's reproductive rights, women's ability to choose what happens to their own bodies, the simple right to be able to have a say in your own medical decisions, your health choices, that is a very clear assault on women. But we always have to remember that it's part and parcel of this larger phenomenon that is taking place, in which an identity crisis is pushing people to create external symbols of their beliefs and their values, not just symbols that they can define themselves against, but symbols that they can imprint their ideals and their values upon. And of course, it's women's bodies. It's always been women's bodies.
Yep. We're going to turn to some questions that I see in the chat, and I'll also watch to see if some hands go up. There's a question from Michelle that is asking, is DEI, or the assault on DEI, I'm going to imagine she means, but a sort of an effective way to reverse Supreme Court rulings that support civil liberties in the way that Roe v. Wade was also reversed? Can we imagine that this is going to lead to Supreme Court reversals that will augment problems about unfair hiring and gender and other working folks, people with disabilities, et cetera?
That's a great question. There's actually was it yesterday or the day before, a Supreme Court decision that I don't have the details in front of me, but that, as I understand it, will make it easier to launch these kinds of reverse discrimination lawsuits involving a woman who claims that she was not hired
Lost out to queer people
because she's not gay. So yeah, I mean, it's really part of a kind of broader move toward regression and toward entrenching gender roles in a different way, certainly, and in sort of rolling back moves toward equality, toward racial equality. It's a way of putting sort of traditionally disadvantaged communities back in their place, or supposedly on their back heel, really. It's really disturbing, but it's also being used as this massive excuse to destroy the institutions of a functioning government. I mean, I feel like Americans have been subject to a propaganda campaign for decades that says that, coming from the right, that government is always bad. Who was it who said, I'd like to shrink the government so small we could drown it in a bathtub?
Grover Norquist.
There
Yeah.
you go. There you go. But I think, certainly there's always room for improvement and more efficiency in government, just as there is in the private sector. But I think we need to be reminded of the many good things that a functioning government does. We need to be reminded of the many bad things that happen when you have a lack of functioning government, when you have kleptocratic government or just totally corrupt government, or when a government is just insufficiently managed or peopled. I mean, there are examples all over the world of dysfunctional or even absent government. And, a lot of those folks are, trying to come to America because it does have or has had a functioning government. I feel like every day it's another agency that's being totally dismantled. And yeah, maybe it could lose 5%, or 10% of the workforce, get rid of the dead wood, and everybody's working a little harder. But when you're talking about slashing numbers in the way that they're doing it, it's actually really deeply alarming.
I'll just say that the Supreme Court has already begun doing this. They are looking for legal arguments to overturn precedent, and DEI is the sort of the easiest way to kind of define the quote unquote problem. If you want to sort of a parallel, I kind of brought it up already. It's what anti-CRT did to public education in the United States, right? So that because of a thing that is totally made up again, we now have entire school districts, entire states, not teaching history, teaching a false version of history. Now, again, they have wanted to do this already. They were desperate for ways to stop teaching about, for instance, slavery or the civil rights movement. And this nonsense term, CRT, and the kind of the anxiety that created was all they needed in order to enact the plan that they had already put in place. And I think DEI is going to work very much in the same way when it comes to anti-regulation and when it comes to the rollback of some of these protections for minorities.
I want to just add to that. You're so right about that. And, I know somebody who works in the government said they received a sort of directive. Like if you think someone in another division or department is using DEI for their hires or in any of their thing, here's like a number you can call and report them.
Yeah.
And it really is going to make people afraid to hire people of color and
Right.
women, because then the scrutiny, oh my gosh, well, is that a DEI hire?
Which is the point.
Am I going to get
point.
It opens you up to being reported and investigated, and it sort of follows with the CRT nonsense that a lot of libraries in school libraries purged their bookshelves of Black authors, because there were all of these authors lists were circulated. This is a CRT book. Well, it's not. I mean, but they say it is, and people comply in advance because they don't want to get in trouble. And that's a lot of the point.
So as the last question, which I will then lead into the sort of what can we do to defend, protect democracy and our communities and the potential of religion to do good in the world at this time. There's a question from somebody else named Reza about thinking about other places and times with various peoples that lived peacefully alongside one another, and what can we learn from them? How is that, I would add, how is it already happening in some corners of our society? How can we magnify and learn from that as well? So some hopeful things to end with.
We always have to end with hope.
Courage and hope.
I'll start. Sure. Look, yes, I'm glad you said it correctly, Rachel, which is this is happening all over the world. It's happening here in the United States. It's everywhere. It doesn't make a lot of news, probably for obvious reasons, because, you know, it's not threatening, it's not sexy, and it doesn't sell, you know, Coke and adult diapers. And so there's no reason why you would have seen it or heard about it. What I will say, though, is if the question is, what's the key to interreligious communalism? I've thought about this a lot. And I think, and this might sound a little strange, but oftentimes we talk about interreligious dialogue as the key to forming these bonds and these connections. And I'm not saying that that's not important. I'm just saying it doesn't really do what you think it does. Talking to each other about the things that we believe is important, because education obviously is important. But as I never get tired of saying, bigotry is not the result of ignorance, right? Bigotry is the result of fear. And fear is impervious to information. Fear is impervious to data or knowledge, right? There's no amount of information that I can give you that gets you to stop being afraid. The only thing that can truly tackle fear is relationships, right? Getting to know the slow slog, the hard work of getting to know people as people. Not as a symbol of a particular religion or a belief system, but just as human beings. And so I'm not the biggest fan, or no, that's the wrong way to put it. I'm not the biggest advocate of interreligious dialogue. I'm a firm believer in interreligious action, right? I don't want Jews and Christians and Muslims to get together and learn about each other. Okay, I mean, yes, good, do that. That's nice. But put aside the metaphors and the symbols that you speak in and recognize that you believe the same thing, that you have the same values, and then just stop talking about it and just go put those values into play together. Actually do things. And that's where relationships are formed, in the actual actions that you take in putting your morals and your views and your beliefs into the world in a positive way. Do it together, and that is the key that opens everything else up.
And thus you have the relationship between CTS and Bayan, where we're trying to build relationships
Yes.
along the way. Anyway, Katherine, you want the last word?
Well, I love that. Do things. I mean, I think that when we do stuff, you know, we can actually make a difference. And I think that a lot of people I speak to or hear from are feeling a lot of anxiety right now. They're afraid. They're horrified by what they're seeing happen. Some of them are losing their jobs. Some of them are, you know, feel like they're being targeted for hate. And I think this is really the time to get out of bed. It's a time for moral courage. We have to, I think when you're active, when you take action to reflect your values in the world, and when you join together with others, it sort of takes away a lot of that fear and a lot of that anxiety because you have a clear path forward. So I really like what you said. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. I would love to speak with you all night, but I don't want to test the patience of the people who've joined us. And we have a couple more things that we want to accomplish while we're together this evening. So I will turn the floor, I think, over to Kim. Is that correct?
That is correct. Thank you, Rabbi Mikva. And thank you to both Reza and Katherine for a very powerful dialogue. It was everything that I hoped it would be. Yes, yes, huzzah. Let us celebrate our dynamic and brilliant speakers. Thank you so much. Time to get out of bed. It is time to get out of bed. Before we end for the evening, as Rachel mentioned, there are a few things just very briefly we would like to share with you, one of which is a celebration. And that is, I get the honor of awarding the Schaalman Interreligious Leadership Award. And our speaker spoke about the power of not just learning interreligiously, because that only takes us so far, but to empower and highlight people, including ourselves, but certainly in this case, others who are doing the actual interreligious engagement and work on the ground, boots on the ground, people who are doing the work that is making a difference in the world. And that is the purpose of the Schaalman Leadership Award. Rabbi Herman E. Schaalman was introduced to CTS in the 1980s by Dr. Andre LaCocque, who we heard about at the very beginning of tonight's session. Rabbi Schaalman, like Dr. LaCocque, was a child of the Holocaust, rescued from Germany in 1935 by an invitation to study at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And by the 80s, Rabbi Schaalman was a prominent Chicago religious leader and activist and invited to teach at CTS. The principle that religious leaders need to understand traditions other than their own, became embedded throughout the curriculum at CTS and remains such. Our commitment to interreligious understanding and action was integrated into the mission and commitment statement of the institution and in frankly all we do. We recognize our responsibility to educate and equip not only our students, but also others in the world to make space for the wide variety of life stances, beliefs, religious traditions of which we are a part. The annual Schaalman Award is given to a student who exemplifies those principles and models them in their lives and in their work. And the Interreligious Institute this year at CTS is excited to announce the awarding of the 2025 Rabbi Herman E. Schaalman Interreligious Leadership Award to CTS student Maher Hussein for his reflection on his time as a community health worker in the Nevada Faith and Health Coalition. The award comes with a $1,000 honorarium, and we would like to take just a moment to congratulate Maher, and we will hear from him in just a moment. But in addition, this year, we are awarding a runner-up prize to CTS student Noseba Mahmoud, who submitted a project to create a replicable toolkit for public schools to be more inclusive in acknowledging the sacred calendar of diverse life stances, built on work that she did in a school district outside of Dallas. This project will be supported with $500 towards the cost of its completion, and we want to perhaps spotlight and give a moment to congratulate Noseba as well. And there she is, wonderful. Congratulations, Noseba. And if people want to applaud and clap, I'm not sure they may be doing that behind me. Wonderful. Congratulations to you. And now, though, I would like to welcome our Schaalman Award winner, Maher Hussein, to say a few words about his project and the value of interreligious work.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May God's peace, mercy, and blessings be upon all of you. I am truly humbled to receive the Schaalman Award tonight. I can't help but reflect how fortunate I am to be in this space, to be a student, to be here with you all, to benefit from the gems, really. I hope the whole thing was recorded, honestly, so that I could play this back. The gems that were dropped tonight, it really has affected me and touched me, as a lot of what was spoken about tonight really kind of reflects how I've been feeling regarding navigating interfaith spaces. When I think about our mission, I think as people of faith, I'm reminded of the African proverb, many hands make light work. And this really, I think, captures what we strive for, that, it's not just the same hands of one village. It's all types of hands, right? From all types of places. And I think there's a comfort and peace in that. It's about combating the hatred and negativity, that sometimes seeps into our societies, and that really actively works to, we need to be actively working to create positive change. a lot of what was spoken tonight, honestly, navigating some of the challenges in interfaith spaces, especially online, as per my personal experience, it can often feel very exhausting and discouraging. The calamity of hate and division can really weigh heavily on the heart. But it's when I come to environments and spaces like these, like Bayan, like CTS, when I'm able to interact with seminary professors, students from all different backgrounds, the Nevada Faith and Health Coalition, the dedication of faith workers, which I'd like to proudly state, a very diverse group of individuals. When I'm able to answer the call of chaplaincy and being able to attend interfaith convenings like this one, it really provides me with a lot of hope. It's spaces like these, it's efforts like these, conversations like these that really remind me that there's a lot of goodness and shared purpose of this work, and it helps me find refuge. And these connections really encourage, I think, us to lift each other up and to prove that love and compassion and common decency and dignity will prevail in the end. Just witnessing just personally from my community health outreach experience, from my public health, just being able to, I was just really shook at how God showed me the intersections of both faith and public health was really one of the greatest blessings in my life. Witnessing how faith communities unite to tackle health disparities in our communities, it's been really inspiring and transformative. And each of our unique perspectives contribute to a lot of solutions that address not just physical health needs, but also the emotional and spiritual well-beings of the people that we serve. And it's really rewarding to see how these initiatives truly nurture our, mutual understanding, our compassion, and our resilience amongst our communities. I feel very incredibly blessed and fortunate that my passion for public health has found a home in interfaith work. And these two realms have really intertwined beautifully. And it's provided me multiple opportunities for growth and beyond just academic. Being able to sit in peace and in mercy with and engage in dialogue with individuals from diverse faith backgrounds really deepens my appreciation for the diverse stories that shape our communities. In a world that often feels divided, I've really come to understand that and feel that this healing, both physically and spiritually, it requires us to listen, reach out, and connect with one another. Again, thank you for this award. It really is a proof of the importance of our collective efforts in community health case management. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be a part of such a dedicated and passionate team. Thank you so much for the recognition and for believing in the work that we've done. God bless you all. Please just want to give a reminder that we need to keep our hands joined and our hearts intertwined, because when we come together, we can really truly lighten the burden for us all. And amidst these challenges, it's the hope generated through the work that we put in together that sustains us. So thank you all. I appreciate it. God bless you all. Jazakumullah khair and barakallah feek.
Thank you so much, Maher. That was beautiful. Thank you for all you are and all you shared with us tonight. We are very excited for both Noseba and yourself. So many congratulations and many thanks. And once again, one final thank you to our very powerful speakers, Katherine Stewart and Reza Aslan. We are so grateful for all you have brought to us tonight. I pass it now to my colleague, Reverend Dr. Brian Smith, to close the evening.
Good evening. I bring you closing blessings on behalf of our board, President Brad Braxton, who is unable to be with us this evening, faculty, students, and friends of CTS. First, I want to lift up our Muslim family this evening as we enter Ramadan. Blessings to you as you move through this holy season. Earlier today, I had the opportunity to gather with interfaith leaders from various religions and backgrounds at Operation Push to strategize around ways that we can stand together against the great challenges that we face in our nation and our world, as white Christian nationalism has taken flesh, dwelling among us and devouring the most vulnerable. And as we stood together today, my mind and spirit drifted towards the words of Psalm 133, which says, "Behold, how good and pleasant it is for brethren and sisters to dwell together in unity. As a Christian formed in the Black Baptist Church, I am mindful of the value of convening, whereby we have the opportunity to congregate, to conspire, and to conjure. We congregate to organize, strengthen, and sustain our unity. We conspire to develop and exchange ideas in order to challenge and improve our ways of thinking. We conjure to create a better world where we all have the opportunity to heal and to flourish. So we have gathered this evening to hear the words of our distinguished guests, Katherine, Stewart, and Reza, and we realize how good it is to be freely educated, free from lies, and open to the truth of scholarship, righteousness, and diverse experiential realities. I'm mindful of the warnings of Jason Stanley, author of How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. Stanley says fascist politics exchanges reality for the pronouncements of a single individual or perhaps a political party. Regular and repeated obvious lying is part of the process by which fascist politics destroys the information space. A fascist leader can replace truth with power, ultimately living without consequence, end quote. People of God and people of goodwill, we are called for such a time as this. Let us find unity in our scholarship, in our faith, our
I think we might be frozen.
I'm going to say that action was coming next. Like getting out of bed in the morning.
That was powerful, exactly. And we can imagine how powerfully that was just going to end of all the timing. There it is. There it is. Now
Amen, Brian.
Amen. Amen. The rest is up to us. Thank you, everybody. Have a really great evening.
Good night.